Officially, welcome to the Center of American Experiments webinar on the state budget report that we just put out. My name is Bill Walsh. I'm the Director of Communications, so I'll just kind of moderate this discussion. For those of you not familiar with the Center of the American Experiment, we are Minnesota's think tank, we like to call ourselves, mostly focused on free enterprise, limited government, and individual freedom. And one of the things that think tanks do around the country, and here in Minnesota especially, is we publish reports. So today we're going to talk about our latest report called Closing Minnesota's Budget Deficit. So the main job of the 2021 legislature will be solving a budget deficit. It's about $1.4 billion. So, but before I introduce the panelists and get into the conversation, we want this to be an interactive event. So those of you in the participating by Zoom and those of you on Facebook watching, if you have any questions, we don't want to listen to ourselves for the full hour. So if there's any questions from the outside, we'd love to take questions. We'll interrupt if it works, and we'll just get them in the chat. So put your questions in the chat or comments. We're in Facebook, and we have some people monitoring that'll let us know as we go. So I'll put that out there first. So joining me on this Zoom are the two economists that put the report together, John Phelan and Martha Njolomole. So I'll start by just letting them introduce themselves and give a little background on who they are and their education before we kind of dig into the report. So John, why don't you go first?
Good morning or afternoon. My name is John Phelan. I'm an economist at the Centre. I've been here now since early 2017, which is actually as long as I've been in the country. I'm from England originally. I got my degree in economics from Birkbeck College at the University of London and my master's from the London School of Economics.
All right, thanks. Martha.
Hi, thank you everybody for joining us. So my name is Martha Njolomole and I am from Malawi. I've been in the country for about 7 years, but I've been in Minnesota for the past year. So I joined the center last October. So I'm very excited to be talking to you today.
All right, great. We have two experts on the economy to talk about the economy and how it relates to the state budget. So let's do State Budget 101, John, just to set the stage. I mean, how do we create the budget and what is it involved and how does it compare maybe to the federal budget we hear so much about?
Well, basically, the situation with the budget in Minnesota is that you have what's called bonding years and budget years at the legislature. So you've just had a bonding year, which is the last one. This is a budget year coming up. And what happens in those is you set the budget, so taxes and spending in the state government for the coming what's called biennium, which is kind of a 2-year period. And so when we talk about this deficit, we were forecast to have a deficit for the year ending in July next year, which will be the end of the biennium that we're in. That's now switched to a surplus. I think Martha will talk to you a little bit more about that. But what we have still is a deficit forecast for the biennium afterwards. And it's that biennium that's going to be the kind of big topic of conversation and debate up in St. Paul in the coming legislative session in the new year.
Yeah, and that current surplus that they announced was, I think, 641 million or so. I mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but they just spent 200 million of that on a kind of a business stimulus plan last week. So I mean, they're already kind of accounting for that current surplus in the current biennium. But what we're going to talk mostly about is the future and future planning. And about a $50 billion biennial state budget is what they'll be working on. And like I said, they're short on a projection of about 1.4 billion. So talk about, Martha, is that the only money available? We have the savings account they talk about too. I mean, how does that come into account, kind of the rainy day fund or budget reserve?
So in Minnesota, we have the rainy day funds, which is basically funds that we set aside if anything very urgent comes up. So this is basically, it will be a good time for that. So we have a deficit of $1.2 billion. And in the rainy day fund, we have $2.4 billion, so which is more than enough to cover for the deficit. But we know how politics work. There's probably going to be some excuses to throw in some increased spending in there, some reasons to increase taxes. So we're still looking at our 3 other options to closing this deficit, which is basically tax hikes or spending cuts, or just a mixture of those two. But that's definitely also an option using the rainy day funds that they can look into. Yeah.
So let's start with that good segue to taxes or tax hikes. John, you wrote a lot in the report about the efficacy of raising taxes, will it work or not, and where we're at now. So let's start there. I mean, some would say, just raise taxes, solve the budget deficit, just go back to that standard solution. What is your reaction to that? What did you guys write about in the report?
Well, there's several things to say about that. Firstly is the fact that Minnesota is already one of the most highly taxed states in America. We have the 5th highest top rate of state income tax in the US, 9.85% on incomes over about $164,000. We don't just tax the rich heavily, though. We have a starting level of state personal income tax that is higher than the top rate of state personal income tax in 25 states. It's a similar story when we look at corporate tax as well. Our corporate tax rate is the 4th highest in the United States. So if we're talking about, we need to raise taxes to close this, well, we've already got very high taxes, and we're looking to raise them further. A second point is that, raising tax rates does not necessarily raise tax revenues. If we look back over the history of Minnesota's various tax rates and revenues that they brought in, well, you don't actually see much of a relationship between rates of taxation and the amount of state income that the government takes in tax. And I think it's just worthwhile explaining here. When a government raises a tax rate, what they are trying to do is appropriate more of the income of the country or the state that they're taxing for themselves to spend. So if you see a tax rate go up, what the government is saying is, we want more of your income, collectively want more of your income. So if you don't see, when tax rates go up or when they're higher levels of tax revenue, what you're seeing there is that there is not much of a relationship or no relationship between rates and revenues. What you actually see is a much more stable relationship between GDP and revenues. If you go back, look at the Department of Revenue data, Minnesota Management and Budget data, and draw a line of tax revenues, and the same for income tax as well, of these revenues as a share of state GDP, of the state's income, you actually see a very flat line on all this. You see a very stable relationship. It's about 6.6, 6.7% of GDP. The averages are all very close together. So what that tells me is that if you're trying to boost the amount of money that the state government has, and that's not what gets me out of bed in the morning, trust me, but if you're trying to boost the dollar amount of state government tax revenue, you should be looking to grow GDP, not tinker about the tax rates.
Well, this gets to a question we always talk about. I mean, there's reasons to do things. We raise taxes because there's a morality to it. It's a fairness issue. We raise taxes to punish people, maybe. But you're saying that raising taxes just may not work. I mean, I think a lot of people at the Capitol might be a surprise for them to hear that over time in the history of Minnesota, as we've raised taxes, it really just hasn't even produced the revenue that they thought it would or would want to.
Yeah, that's what you see if you look back historically. It's an interesting question, actually. If you ask people, what's tax for? What's the point of tax? Why does the government tax people? If you ask me, my answer would be that the government imposes taxes to raise the revenues to pay for goods and services that it's deemed that the government ought to provide. And I think actually that's probably what most people would say. That's probably the common answer. But you are starting to see a change. So for example, the estate tax in Minnesota, we've done research, other people have done research that show that with the estate tax, for example, that pushes people out of the state who don't want to pay it. And when they go, they take with them future payments of things like income tax, sales tax, etc. And if you offset the one-time revenue from the estate tax in a given year with the revenue loss in future years of people it pushes out, then in many cases, the estate tax is a net revenue loss for the state government. So you can say to people, if you're interested in having, revenue for the state government, get rid of the estate tax, you'll actually have more of it. But people, even when you can get people to acknowledge that logic, many of them, increasing number of them, will say, but the point is not that people pay this. The point is that it brings people down. It makes people fair. It makes things fair. And you start to see this argument that we should have very high levels of taxation so that nobody pays them. The idea, that's why you have something like a 90% top rate of tax or 100% top rate of tax. Nobody's going to work that extra, bit if 100% of all the pay goes off to the tax man. And that's fairly standard, really, and nobody really quibbles with that. And actual fact, that logic, that Laffer curve logic, has now been enthusiastically embraced on the left of people who say that we should hike tax rates exactly so that revenue falls, because you crash incomes as well.
Wow. I mean, that's that idea that tax rates affect behavior. Of course it does, right? I mean, people aren't going to act in a vacuum. They're going to react. They're going to do something. We did a report a few years ago on sort of the flight out of Minnesota. You hear about it, anecdotally, oh, my accountant says that he's losing a lot of clients because the tax rates are up and they're moving to Florida. We actually produced a report on that. I want you to hit on that just a minute, because I think it fits here with that. Tax rates go up, behavior follows.
Well, exactly. There's a huge amount of literature on this. Our report was just one part of it, that shows that people do move in response to tax rates. Especially in a country like the United States, where it's relatively costless to move from, Minnesota to Iowa or Minnesota to South Dakota. It's not like moving from, Britain to Russia or something like that, where there's an awful lot of hurdles you have to jump. People can move a lot easier. That makes the responsiveness much greater. And like I say, there's a wealth of academic literature on this. There was a fantastic report came out just, I think maybe this year, possibly 2019, and it was kind of a meta-analysis, I think by the NBER, of all the literature on people's responsiveness to taxation. And they found, that taxes influence where people go. And that's not a surprise. And what's interesting, I think, is that taxes are kind of negative incentives. So if you want to stop people smoking, what do? We put the taxes up on cigarettes. If you want to stop people drinking, what do? We put the taxes up on booze. Now apply that logic consistently. What do you think is going to happen if you put the taxes up on working? What do you think is going to happen if you put the taxes up on investing? Why does the logic apply here and not apply there? I would love somebody to be able to explain that to me.
Awesome. And then before we leave this tax rate realm, you said something that we've heard before, but I think it needs repeating. Our lowest tax rate, our lowest rate that hits the people as they first enter the tax system, is higher than half. Is the highest rate in 25 of the states. I mean, there's a chart on it in our report that people can look at, but that is a fascinating stat.
Yeah, our lowest, our starting rate of state personal tax, income tax in Minnesota is 5.35% on the first dollar of taxable income, and that lowest rate is higher than the top rate in 25 other states.
And that just needs to be repeated. And if you look at the chart, the first 6 or 8 states on the bottom of that list have zero. Obviously, they don't tax income at all, so they're the first. Then the other 19 or 18 just have lower highest rates than our lowest rate. I don't know. That blows my mind a little bit. So tax rates don't necessarily work. Raising them doesn't provide more income for the government. The GDP is the key then. So maybe just talk a little bit, John, about how or the impact tax rates or raising them have on GDP, because it's going to be a negative, right? I mean, if we want GDP to grow, how do tax rates affect that?
Well, that's the thing. If you're trying to increase tax revenue, and the relationship is much stronger between GDP and revenue than it is between tax rates and revenue, then you've got to be looking at what grows GDP, not what bumps up tax rates. So what does bump up GDP? Well, we know one thing that does push it down, actually, and there's a big consensus in the empirical literature on this, that high tax rates or tax hikes depress economic growth. So actually, if you are trying to increase government revenues by hiking tax rates, not only is that probably not going to work, but it will actually have in terms of appropriating a greater share of the state's income for the government to spend, but it will probably lower the dollar amount of revenue that the government has to spend by slowing economic growth.
So there it is. Once again, it doesn't work. We have a question from the chat for you, John, on this tax conversation. How many years are we away from becoming the California of the Midwest? I feel we are very close, if not already there, in terms of taxes and liberal policies. More people I know are complaining and talking about moving. Texas seems to be a common destination. I mean, are we going to be the California of the Midwest here?
Well, Adam Smith said there is much ruin in a nation. It might not be that we're about to fall off a cliff yet. But things can go bad, and they can go bad quite quickly. If you look at the situation in Minneapolis, I first visited Minneapolis in 2007 on a trip here, and I remember the downtown. It was kind of nice, it was kind of bustling and all the rest of it. You go around there now, and this is not just kind of post riots and COVID. This is going back, when I first moved over here. There's been a real marked deterioration in the urban core, which is really kind of very important to the state's economy. In terms of how many years, I don't know, but it's worth remembering that Detroit at one time was the richest city in America, the highest incomes in America, and that went south. That went bad. So the idea that you've got, a high standard of living here now, that's true. But you can't take it for granted. All the wealth that you have, it has to come from somewhere. It doesn't just fall like manna from heaven.
Thank you. So looking ahead then to the next session and budgets, we've kind of hit taxes and the efficacy of taxes and everything. We got two economists here. I want to just pick your brains as economists. Give us the crystal ball. We've got the pandemic, worldwide pandemic, but now a vaccine on the horizon. The forecaster that the state contracts with, this IHS the economic firm, is pretty positive on 2021 in terms of growth, especially the second half. Where do you guys stand? Martha, why don't we start with you? I mean, what is as an economist, if somebody at a cocktail party asks you, what is 2021 looking like? What do you answer?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty optimistic too, because I think most of the changes we've seen, especially with the job losses and businesses closing, was because of all of these actions by governments on locking down, social distancing. So I think if everything comes back to normal with the vaccine, especially, we're gonna see a lot of people are coming back to their normal activities, going back to restaurants and bars. That is assuming that we don't put any more restrictions on these places, because I think for most of them, what has hurt them the most has been the uncertainty surrounding locking down, opening up again. Some of them have to close because they can't plan for the future. So if they can have some sort of certainty, especially over the next couple of months, I think things will begin to look up after the vaccine and everything.
John, without giving us stock tips or what to do with our portfolios, what is your best read on 2021 as we head in?
Well, to some extent, Milton Friedman used to talk about like plucking a string and all the rest of it. So you have this kind of trend growth of the economy, and it can dip, but it bounces back quite a bit. I think you have seen that to a large extent in the third quarter of this year. It's forecast that you'll see it a bit more, but a bit less. In the fourth quarter, the most recent forecast I saw was for 11.4% GDP growth in the fourth quarter. You can't keep that up. At some point that GDP growth is going to fall. It's going to fall substantially, and you will hope to get back to something like regular growth. The difficulty is, of course, that in the last 20 years in America, the regular rate of growth has not been all that great. That's subject for another day, perhaps. My guess is that you will see GDP levels decline, GDP growth levels decline. You probably hit something like 2% next year. A lot of that depends on things, though. I think one of the absolute worst things that could happen is that the incoming administration decides to hike taxes, or it decides to clamp on a load of stupid regulations that just raise the cost of business and the cost of living. And if you do that, then given the current weakness of the economy in the midst of COVID, then that could be pretty bad.
Right. So we've spent the first half of this discussion on revenue and income and how do we get more money into state coffers. My experience working at the Capitol has been that most of those people spend way too much time on that side of the equation. Like, how do we get more revenue? Because they just make this assumption that all of the spending that we're doing is righteous and good. So the second half of our little program here today, and certainly the second half of the report, we'll focus on the spending. And Martha, you spent a lot of your time on the report on the spending side. So just, is all that spending righteous, and are we kind of down to bare bones in state government, or where are we at on the overall spending picture in Minnesota?
Yeah, so when we looked at the spending, we tried to compare where we are at right now compared to, let's say 2010 is the farthest that we got. So when you look at the general spending, that is the general fund, like that is just state revenues and how they're spent. We found that we've been on an upward trend throughout all these past 9 years. So that is after adjusting for inflation, and that was even after adjusting for per capita spending. So when we look at how much Minnesota is spending per person, in 2019, actually, we're spending about 27% more than we did in 2010. So we've grown so much in a space of just 9 years, which is quite a lot. Some of these, I think, especially when we're looking at spending, one of these, the worries about it, I think the concerns about it is the change in prices and everything. That's why we try to adjust to inflation, just so we show you the big picture of this has nothing to do with rising prices or people population growing. So we have seen that there's a growth here that has nothing to do with any of those factors.
Yeah, that's the key. Always trying to make that apples to apples comparison. And you have in this report, you've adjusted for inflation, you've adjusted for population growth and things like that. What about education? I mean, the biggest drivers in the state budget, at least, are education, K-12 and higher education, and then healthcare, welfare spending, which we'll hit in a minute. So how do we stack up on education? You hear the teachers union and a lot of people saying we need to fully fund education. How are we doing on that? I don't even know what that means, but how are we doing on education spending?
Yeah, so I don't really know what that means either, but I am guessing they just want more funds. But when we look at education, actually, so in the state budget, education accounts for at least, for the past 8 years, it has accounted for at least 30% of our budget. So it's one of the biggest ones. And when it comes to how much we spend per pupil, actually, we were slightly above the national average. So we're pretty on par on as far as education is concerned. So I think we're pretty good on there. The biggest one happens to be warfare. Yeah, which is
yeah, we're going to do that next. So we are national average or slightly above national average when it comes to K-12 education spending or education spending, but that's not the case when it comes to welfare spending. And that's one of the big findings, I think, in this report is kind of our rank. Talk about where we rank in welfare spending.
all right. So in this report, we only included numbers from 2010. So when we look at warfare, actually, the U.S. Census Bureau defines warfare mostly as programs targeted towards low-income individuals. So for the nation, most of the big programs are Medicaid, which is like healthcare for low-income individuals, and then we have the temporary assistance for needy families. So these are the cash payments to people. So in Minnesota, this is the MFIP program. And then we have housing assistance, which is where you give, I think there's rental payments in there too. And then we have the SNAP program, which is basically the food stamps. So these are the four main big ones, which are funded by both state and governments. And then when it comes to Minnesota specifically, we have programs like general assistance, which gives cash to people that are not eligible for these other federal programs. And we have Minnesota Care and like Minnesota Supplemental Aid. So all of these programs are in there, all of these are counted. So because these programs are mainly for low-income people, so we try to analyze how much we spend per poor person, just to make for a good comparison. So what we found out was that in 2018, Minnesota actually had the third highest spending per person in poverty. So we're spending $30,000, but when we went to the national average, the number was just $17,000. So we're almost double the national average, which is pretty high. And the same was also true for 2010. So in 2010, we are spending actually $20,000, but the nation was just $11,000, so still almost double. And we've grown too since then. You can see here, it was 20,000 in 2010, in 2018, it was 30,000. So we've grown about 50%, which is, yeah, pretty high. And this this is also very concerning, considering the fact that we're already high, but we've grown more than like 30 other states, though, that we're not even as high as we were. So, yeah.
So the trend is up, and we've already were at the top, and we are trending up. One of the things you wrote before we wrote this report and produced it before the November forecast came out. And so as we came into the November forecast, we were predicting to be short about $2.4 billion. That was the kind of the May forecast look. And you talked about the impact of just moving, trying to solve that budget deficit number of 2.4. Talk about that a little bit, because I thought it was fascinating what that would do to us in terms of our rank.
Yeah, so using those numbers, actually, what we found was that if we had taken the $2.4 billion out of just the general fund spending, we would have gotten to 2016, 2017 spending levels, that is in per capita terms, which is like 3-4 years ago, which is not so long ago. We're not making any drastic changes here. And when it comes to warfare, actually, if we took that money out of just warfare specifically, that means we'll be the 6th highest level of per person in poverty warfare spending in the nation, which is still pretty generous. And right now, yeah, considering the fact that the numbers are even lower, so that shouldn't be as drastic as even before. So we'll be talking about maybe 2018, 2019 numbers.
So back to the horrible times of 2 or 3 years ago, and when terrible things were happening in the streets of Minnesota. And you're saying if we went there to try and solve the deficit, we would drop in our national rankings from 3 all the way down to 6.
Yeah.
So really still top 10 in terms of, if generosity is the word. Maybe we can talk about that in a minute. We are getting some really good questions kind of on topic, so I'm going to try and take some questions. I mean, one person asked, what specific things in the state budget are good targets to cut? I'll throw that. Maybe you can start, Martha, but you've been kind of addressing it here, but maybe if there's anything more specific. People always ask that, well, specifically, what would you cut?
Yeah, I think when we look at the budget, education and welfare seem to be the biggest one by far. So those, I think, would seem like good targets. But as I've already said, education, we're pretty much on average. So warfare is the biggest one, considering how much we've been growing and how much we've already been spending highly. So I think one of the issues when you tell people about cutting warfare, they get concerned, like, well, what about all these poor people? What are they going to do? But the thing is, with considering how high we are compared to the nation, there has to be some room there for us to analyze, are we spending on the right things? Is this money actually going to people? Because our eligibility limits, especially when you look at them, they're very high. In 2018, actually, when I was looking at the limit that we have on income for somebody to be eligible for income assistance, we had the highest limit in the nation. So when you look at things like that, I think we will find that there's room actually to be more purposeful with our spending. I think if the matter was that we could take people out of poverty by spending more, we could have done that a long time ago, but that hasn't happened yet. So there has to be something else we can do apart from just throwing money at warfare.
And what about fraud? I mean, that's another area that we've worked on in the center. We have a scandal tracker on our website people can find. It kind of tracks recently some of the just fraud or waste, and that drives people crazier than anything. And that money is not getting to people to help them. It's being wasted.
Yeah, definitely. There's an issue with fraud there. I think especially considering that most of these warfare programs are like third-party programs. So we just give the money to the people and then we expect them to give it to the poor people. So nobody's really looking at how this money is being spent. So if we actually try to analyze, we'll find a lot of issues like just money going somewhere where it's not supposed to go.
Good. Back to questions, and this is a bigger topic. Maybe John, I don't know if we know the answer to this, but how big of a reopening of the economy is baked into the current budget forecast? I mean, so do you know, John and Martha, when they did the forecast, did they kind of predict a reopening of the economy in the spring or 2021?
Yes, they did. When they the most recent forecast is based on measures and expiring, I think, by the end of this week, which we now know is not the case. I would have to go back and check to be 100% on that. But obviously, the longer you keep your, foot on the head of the economy, the worse your economic outcomes are going to be. It's just not sustainable that we continue to keep these things closed and try to keep the gap filled with borrowed money from the federal government. It's bad policy. It's bad news.
Yeah, and a similar question or even a comment, but along those lines, if the deficit erased itself this year, which kind of happened, we thought it was going to be 2.4 billion, it turned out to be 641 million to the good. Driven by DHS forecast, the biggest spending in the budget, wouldn't it make sense that the February forecast would very likely also erase as more people go back to work? Do you guys see that as a possibility, that this number keeps getting better as we head into February?
I do. I mean, one of the things about this, and I think it surprises people actually, just how well we've done. I said before that if I go back to May, if I put myself back in that position, or April or March or something, if you'd have said to me then that we would close out this year with a budget surplus, I would have thought you were nuts. That seemed completely incredible, but that hasn't happened. And I think, well, why is that? One thing that I think is a real answer is that if you look at the data for employment by earnings, you see that the people with the highest earnings, their employment has kind of bobbed along, a slight dip, but it's back up. And people with the highest earners are actually, their employment levels are up than from January. But if the further down you go, the further down the earning spectrum you go, you see that the fall in employment was actually a lot steeper, and that the recovery has been a lot slower. This is what you might hear about the K-shaped recovery. And that's the idea that, for the top people, it's gone boom, boom, back up. And for people at the bottom, it's still just chugging along the bottom. And there's some truth in that. Now, where you have, progressive tax system like we have, the richer people pay the vast majority of the taxes. So if the richer people have lost their jobs less, then you would expect not to see a decline in tax revenues, income tax revenues, proportionate to the decline in incomes, to the decline in employment, sorry. So I think that's actually why state revenues have held up much better than people expected. Not just here. I know for a fact that Wisconsin has actually beat revenue projections. Iowa, their deficit has almost vanished. South Dakota is doing very well. And so this is actually where a state level think tank, there's a federal question here. This idea that we need more federal bailout money, it's just not true.
Yeah. Another question, a little political now. Given the current legislative makeup, how realistic is it that our leadership will go to the most logical areas like welfare spending that Martha's been talking about to reduce spending? Any predictions on that, Martha? I mean, you follow the legislature a little bit. I mean, what's the political makeup? How does that lead to a good solution?
So yeah, I do try to follow, but I have to say I don't have a very clear idea of what the next session will be like. But I assume that with COVID and everything, because in the fact that these lockdowns have affected low income people, there's definitely going to be a push for some like increase in spending for like assistance programs, because I think we've seen this with a lot of like states. There's already an op-ed that John commented on in some newspaper whereby the writer was saying that we should raise taxes on the wealthiest people to provide for assistance to our low-income people who have been affected by COVID. So I assume there's going to be a push for that. There was already a push for some increase in spending for other programs, even in the last year before COVID, like childcare assistance. So that's definitely going to come back even stronger now, I assume. So it's up to the other people, I guess, to be logical about this, to look at the numbers and say, no, we're already spending so much. There's only so much we can do to help people.
One thing that I think we have to note is that something has to happen. There is a balanced budget amendment in the state's constitution, so they have to have a balanced budget over the course of the biennium. So if they've got a forecast deficit, then they either have to raise taxes or cut spending. I think there's absolutely no argument for increased taxes for the reasons that we've explained. And, really legislators up in St. Paul should hold firm to that line. I've absolutely no doubt, as Martha says, that people are going to try and use COVID as an excuse to sneak more spending through. I think as Martha alluded to, we hear a lot about equity gaps and inequities in Minnesota, and we constantly hear that we need to have more government spending to cure these things. But as you've heard, Minnesota's government welfare spending has been very, very high, going back to at least 2010, and we still have these inequities. We still have these equity gaps. So what you have there, it seems fairly obvious to me, is that if you think these equity gaps are a problem that needs to be solved, it seems to me to be quite clear that huge amounts of government money are not solving the problem, and maybe we should be looking at something else. The idea that we can get rid of these things by spending more government money and more taxpayers' money would seem to me to be a theory that has been tested to destruction.
Yeah, and here's a good question or comment. And we're getting a lot of questions and comments. We might just try to hit them because it really helps the conversation. Someone wrote, some people don't need a bailout, but these businesses are being crushed by lockdowns and restrictions are hanging on by a thread and do need help. So it kind of gets to what you were talking about, Jonathan. Is government really good at this in terms of trying to hand out money to help people after shutting them down? I mean,
well, the analogy that I use on this, and look, as a free market guy, I don't like arguing for government to be spending money and bailing businesses out. But I think there is an issue here that, like I say, the analogy I use is like if you smash a baseball through your neighbor's window, who pays for the window? Well, you do, because you smashed it on behalf of your kid or whatever. But whoever breaks it pays for it. And I think the same thing applies with these businesses. Leave aside for a moment the argument of whether the government should have the ability to just command these businesses to close. Leave aside for a moment the argument of whether closing all these businesses down is a useful response to this pandemic. Just leave those aside. Proceed from the point that the government has closed these businesses down. Then it seems to me that you can make a very sincere and very honest and strong case that the government, having visited these damage on these businesses, has a duty to help them and to bail them out. Like I say, because if you smashed a baseball through your neighbor's window, you'd have to fix it.
Yeah, I think
go ahead. Sorry.
This is like the same analogy with like breaking somebody's legs and giving them a wheelchair. So in the same sense, you have to do something to help them because they don't have legs now. So,
but at least in the case of the federal government, because they're borrowing, who's going to pay for that? And then what is the economic impact of this in 5 years, let's say? Or I mean, is it going to be an anchor around the national economy to grow? Is that what we're looking at as the federal government just keeps? It's great to get another $600 check they're talking about in Congress right now, but who's going to pay for that?
Well, where's this money going to come from? It's going to get borrowed, which means at some point it gets paid for. I mean, nobody pays the debt off. There's not really a point where, or we've paid back everything we owe. What they do is they roll the debt over. So what you do is, as a debt becomes due, so let's say you have to pay somebody who holds a treasury bill $50. As you become due to pay them that, what you do is you roll it over by borrowing $50, paying this guy off, and the guy that you just borrowed the $50 from, you're now in debt to him. So that's what they mean by rolling over. The thing is, you do become liable to to interest rate spikes if that happens, because I mean, this is what caught countries like Italy and Greece a few years ago. They weren't able to borrow in a currency that they could print. So the interest rate spiked, and they were suddenly, finding it very difficult to roll over their debts as they became due at affordable rates. Now, the US government is different because we do print the currency that we borrow in. So it is true that the federal government technically can never go bankrupt because it can always print as much money as it needs to cover its liabilities. But anybody who finds that comforting should think twice, because all that is saying is that we don't need to worry about turning into Greece because we can turn ourselves into Zimbabwe instead, which is, nobody wants to do that. The idea that we can trade off, we can escape from this debt trap by diving headlong into inflation, I think that's a very bad idea. Unfortunately, it's an idea, things like modern monetary theory, which is one of the craziest things around. It's an idea that more and more people seem to take seriously.
Okay, we'll save that for another webinar because you're starting to lose me. But let's get back to Minnesota. Someone on the chat asked kind of a different question, but the decrease in gas tax revenues due to lack of people driving, frankly, what impact might that have on the future infrastructure funding?
Well, there's an interesting point here that some of these responses are kind of, they're unforeseen. Now, that one, perhaps you could have foreseen. If you tell people to stop traveling, gas tax revenues are going to fall. But at the same time, one thing that I think is, and this is another thing that's helped revenues hold up, is that we are spending, I mean, so for example, sales tax falls mostly on goods rather than services. Now, if you've got an economy where you shut down most of the services and tell people to stay at home, and what are they going to do? They get their $1,200 and they go shopping on Amazon and they buy goods. So you shifted people's spending from things that don't have a sales tax, things that don't have a sales tax on them so much, to things that do. And so what you've seen is people shifting their consumption patterns to things that where taxes are higher. And so that's one of the things actually that the Department of Revenue, Minnesota Management and Budget said have held up tax revenues. Now, nobody would have necessarily, maybe somebody would have foreseen that, but we're in such a kind of wacky circumstance that these things are a surprise. In terms of infrastructure funding, the gas tax thing is a real problem. But I mean, does the gas tax cover the cost of the infrastructure anyway? As vehicles become more fuel efficient, a car that, so let's say you've got a car that's twice as fuel efficient as another car, and they're both driving on the same road. Both of them pretty much impose the same wear and tear on the road.
They weigh the same.
Yeah. But one of them is paying half as much for the wear and tear as the other one. So that's an issue that does need to be addressed at some level. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the rainy day fund. I think this would be a major question for the legislature going forward, because we've talked about the tax revenues and raising taxes or cutting them. We've talked about spending. The third opportunity in solving a deficit is the rainy day fund. I think this is going to be a question for the 2021 session. Is it raining? Is it raining in Minnesota right now? In other words, should we go get money out of that reserve, and maybe how much? Martha, why don't you start? I mean, what is your opinion on whether it's raining right now?
Well, I think at the beginning of the year, when we had that $2.4 billion deficit and then the 4.7 billion after, I think that was like a very big issue to most legislatures, because it was like a very big number that they had to figure out really how to close it, because you cannot just close a deficit of $2.4 billion by just like they had to look at more options than just raising taxes and cutting spending. So I think with $1.2 billion, I think there's a less urgency here. So there's a possibility that it might just be like, well, it's not really as much as it was before. So we can maybe put in some a little bit of tax hikes here and there, and then we'll be good to go. There's also the possibility that the logical ones would be like, well, it's because it's not as high as it was before. Then this gives us a chance to actually solve it by using the rainy day funds. So I think it really depends on how they look at it. But I think with what we've presented here today, will probably be a good option to use that money if we don't want to do anything like cut spending or do tax hikes. But yeah, that would depend really on how they look at it, I think.
Yeah, ultimately it is a political decision. John, what do you think? Is it raining in Minnesota?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look over what's happened in the last year or so, we've had, a historically unprecedented plunge in GDP. We've made a lot of that back up, but we've also seen, this huge spike in unemployment, which, I mean, the unemployment rate, I just got an email today from the state government telling me that it was down again to about 4.4%. But a lot of that's being driven by people just drifting out of the labor force. So our labor force participation rate is down. So we've actually got a lot of hidden unemployment out there. I would argue that if a once in a century pandemic that trashes your economy at numbers you've never seen before, puts all these people out the labor force isn't raining, then I have no idea what your rainy day fund is for. It's surely for exactly this kind of thing.
Yeah, and if I weighed in, I think I'd say the same thing. And my prediction would be that policymakers will go to that well. I don't think they'll take too much out of that rainy day fund, but in a final deal in May when they need to, really compromise. That rainy day fund, I think, will be a big part of it. Another question from the comments. Many cities that receive CARES Act dollars, this is a little bit off topic, but it's on the state budget, certainly. Cities receive CARES Act dollars, but had no COVID related expenses or needs, just put the money in their reserve funds. Do you think the legislature will let that happen again? And really, it wasn't even the legislature, it was the federal government that controlled CARES Act funding more than anything. And in the first part of the CARES Act, when those original dollars came through, they were very restricted. And then we got new federal guidance in the fall saying, well, you can go ahead and put that in your city budget and use it for anything. So, I mean, what do you guys think of that? That sort of that the federal government sends money to the states, which goes down to the county and city level, and then you have cities and counties handing out money trying to help people recover from the CARES Act.
Well, that was always going to be an issue. The thing with the CARES Act, so for example, these $1,200 checks that people got, I got one, didn't need it. I just went and worked from home. My income didn't go down over this year. So what would I get this check for? I just put it towards buying a house. It's now you can look at that and say that's bad policy, and on one level that's correct. But at the time, the pressure was just to push money out as quickly as possible. So this money just got shoved out of Washington with very little oversight or control. Very little thought, really. That's the issue. Not so much thought. And there were these kind of half-baked ideas, as you alluded to try and control and make sure it wasn't just used as a kind of local slush fund. But it does mean that money ended up everywhere, not necessarily where it was needed, but everywhere. So there are people that have kind of run out of their money. There are people who've got piles of it sat about. How we unwind that is going to be a big question, because if you're somewhere that's not particularly hit hard and you do just have this pile of CARES Act cash, what are you going to do? Send it back? I think that's a difficult one. So I don't know. That's one for the politicians to unpack.
Yeah. Any thoughts on the CARES Act, Martha?
Well, yeah, I thought it was very interesting that the rules kept changing for sure. I think it was hard, especially for some state governments especially some that had hardships with the budgets. They couldn't, in the beginning, they couldn't use the money for some other things they needed, but then later on they could then use it, which was, yeah. So I was just very concerned with the uncertainty surrounding it, but I think like the end of it, especially for Minnesota, I think the money was useful for some other things that we needed. So yeah, you can give it back, as John said. So as well, just use it.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question from Martha that is a little off topic, but I like it, and maybe we can make it a little more on topic. We are running out of questions, and we're gonna wrap up before we get to the hour, maybe. But this question is for you, Martha. What do you like better about Minnesota compared to Malawi? And maybe you could do that personally, because I think people are interested, and also what maybe compare government structures or government forms, and that might be a little more on topic, but.
So I mean, I've been here for 4 years, so most of that time has been on lockdown, so I haven't really had a chance to experience Minnesota. So I'll have more ideas once things are open. But as far as governments are concerned, I think also in Malawi, you're more of like a centralized system, so it's very different from here. So I think the good thing about here that people don't seem to realize the amount of choice you have about it, just about starting a business. There's a lot of opportunities here. It doesn't cost as much to start a business, to get a loan. Like just the system gives you a lot more freedom for you to make choices. It's very different in Malawi because you have most of your services provided by the government, so you have very little choice. So what I like about Minnesota, just the country in general, is just the level of opportunities you have. You get to experience this kind of life whereby one thing that I found very peculiar was that when you're choosing like college majors and stuff like that. There's like a whole lot of choice because you're just thinking about what you're good at, what your talents are, because the market is that broad here. You have so many opportunities after you graduate, but it's not the same in most of these other countries. So I find it very hard to believe when people are pushing for like socialism, everything free, or put all these rules there, raise taxes for everybody, when it's hard to see for somebody who has lived here how hard life is when you put all these impediments on people really to live, I think.
Sure. So one final question then for the panelists. Thank you for that. We've written this report. We had it come out when the budget deficit announcement or forecast announcement came out in December. What advice do you have, knowing what we have in this report as they head into 2021? If we had legislators in the audience and the governor are listening right now among the people watching this program, what advice do you have them generally as they head into 2021? John, why don't you go first?
Well, I talked about kind of possibilities for the economy next year, and how a kind of downside risk factor on that would be tax hikes or something like that from an incoming administration. The same applies at the state level. Hiking taxes here with the economy as it is would be bad news. It would be particularly bad news on top of the tax hikes that we already have. In fact, there's research that shows that the negative impacts of tax hikes and high taxes are worse when you already have high taxes, which we do. So, we are the last state that should be looking at increasing taxes. And that really has to be hammered home. Somebody once said, read my lips, no new taxes. I mean, we know now how that works out. And hopefully, that message gets taken on board and stuck to with a little bit more durability than George Bush did.
Great. Martha?
Yeah, so I think when you look at these issues, especially with warfare spending, this is a concern that's been a while, for a couple of years now. People are raising these concerns about how high we're spending on warfare, even way before COVID. So I think COVID has just brought to light that we need to actually analyze how much we spend on warfare and see if we can do better on that. I think this is not the time to double down and just throw money at people just to see if they'll figure out a way to go from there. I think that there's a good chance that this is something we were going to have to do anyway in the future, because we've been putting a lot of pressure on our budget, just increasing spending on warfare. So I think the time is right now with COVID, just to look to make things better with spending. Yeah.
All right, thank you. My advice to the legislature would be, don't let the budget deficit go to waste. It's a great opportunity to provide some pressure to cut spending. If there was a surplus, it's impossible to really examine programs, bring any accountability at all. Use this $1.4 billion deficit in the next biennium to bring some pressure to hold people accountable and cut some spending. That is going to be our final word. Thank you for everybody for tuning in for this webinar. You can find this report that we've been talking about on our website at Center of the American Experiment, americanexperiment.org. You can find a lot more information there. The site is updated hourly, almost, certainly daily, with new information, relevant information. So we encourage everybody to go to our website. And then you'll also hear about future events. Hopefully future events involve us being in the same room at some point. But thanks for everybody tuning in, and we're going to sign off.
Thanks a lot.